Every year, tens of thousands of your refugees and migrants travel into Europe through some of the most dangerous migration passageways in the world. Overall, many children, especially adolescent boys, as well as young men, move towards Europe. Throughout their journey, they are exposed to different forms of violence, including sexual violence.
Sexual violence, including sexualized torture, is committed against men and boys in many armed conflicts, and also along the different migration routes to Europe, particularly in Libya. Some men and adolescent boys also experience various types of sexual violence, including sexual exploitation, after their arrival in Europe. Unaccompanied boys, boys and men with diverse sexual orientation and gender identities, boys and young men with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to sexual violence and sexual exploitation. The impacts of all forms of sexual violence can be severe, not only for the survivors, but also for their families and communities. Sexual violence has many different short and long-term consequences, including psychological, physical, social, and economic. Often people in general, as well as frontline workers, are not aware that male youth are at risk of sexual violence and exploitation.
In fact, there are many myths about sexual violence against youths that are incorrect and that everyone, but in particular frontline workers working with boys, need to address better support survivors and encourage them to reach out for help.
Myth: young men should be strong enough to fight off a perpetrator. Fact: this assumption is based on the harmful gender stereotype that men and boys are always strong and able to fight. Anyone can become a victim of sexual violence, and the victim is never to blame. Myth: sexual exploitation of adolescent boys by women is not a serious issue. Fact: all types of sexual violence by any perpetrator is harmful. Even if it is far less common for women to commit sexual violence, the violence committed by them is still harmful. Myth: boy survivors of sexual violence will become perpetrators as adults. Fact: research shows that the majority of boys who are sexually abused do not become violent as adults and do not abuse children themselves. Myth: men and boys who experienced a spontaneous erection during sexual violence must have enjoyed it. Fact: anyone can sometimes experience a physical reaction that they cannot control. It does not mean that they wanted the sexual violence or that they liked it. Myth: sexual abuse by men causes boys and young men to become gay. Fact: sexual violence, especially rape by a male perpetrator, can lead to heterosexual boys and young men feeling confused about their sexual orientation. Gay boys and young men may feel that the abuse caused their sexual orientation. Sexual violence does not define a boy's or young man's sexuality or change their sexual orientation. Myth: since in some societies it is acceptable to think having sexual contact between an adult man and a boy is in their culture, it is not really sexual violence. Fact: any sexual contact between an adult and a child is sexual violence, even if the survivor does not think he has been abused. For example, bachabazi or boy for play are common in some parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Service providers can fail to recognize this as sexual violence as it is seen as a cultural practice.
The first step is to understand that sexual violence happens to boys and young men and looks beyond the myths. The frontline workers should aim to create a safe environment and to provide support if and when survivors want to talk about what happens to them.
In order to do so, building trust is crucial. Gaining trust depends first and foremost on our attitude and behavior. To help build a trusting relationship with male youth, it is important to apply a survivor-centered approach by practicing the principles of safety, confidentiality, respect, and non-discrimination. Show a genuine interest in them. Show empathy and acceptance of, for example, their sexual orientation and gender identity. Be reliable, present and available, and be honest about what you can and cannot do to support the adolescent boy or young man. The setting also matters for the development of trusting relationships. Ask what elements are important for a safe setting and try to accommodate their feedback. It is important to offer spaces where male youth feel safe, can receive practical support to meet their basic needs, socialize and participate in age-appropriate educational and recreational activities that they enjoy. It's important to build on existing programs where appropriate. Activities to support survivors can often be implemented through programs that are already in place. Finally, providing relevant information and raising awareness are essential. Providing information on sexual violence can include the fact that it is a risk for boys and young males, that survivors have the right to access care, the benefits of accessing care, and from where they can get support. Of course, frontline workers must be prepared to receive disclosure of sexual violence. All staff and volunteers working with migrants and refugees should be trained in the guiding principles of the survivor-centered approach and in psychological first aid, so that they can provide an appropriate response to a disclosure. Psychological first aid uses 4 actions.
Prepare, which means at least knowing referral options for male survivors of sexual violence and have basic training is essential.
Look, which means paying close attention to the male youth you work with, will help you to be ready to offer support when needed. Remember that your role is not to seek out survivors of sexual violence, but to be available and equipped in case someone discloses.
Listen, which means staying calm, be supportive and listen to the survivor without judgment. You should never pressure survivor to disclose.
Link, which means encouraging survivors to make their decisions about the next steps, who to consult and when to do so, while providing necessary support. Psychological first aid should be applied to disclosures of sexual violence that happened in the past, in the survivor's country of origin, or during their journey to Europe, and for cases where the abuse is recent or ongoing.
To learn more about supporting male youth survivors, please access the field guide. Support young male refugees and migrants in Europe who are survivors or at risk of sexual violence.